November 1922. A new intake of Scottish MPs board third-class compartments at Glasgow's St Enoch station, bound for Westminster. Five years earlier, Lenin had led the Bolshevik workers to victory in St Petersburg. John Maclean, Scotland's foremost Marxist, had tried and failed to start another revolution on the Clyde. Now, Maclean's Red Clydesiders were taking their fight for worker power to the mother of parliaments. For the next 15 years, their battle with fellow Scot and Labour Party leader Ramsay MacDonald will be for the heart of socialism and the British Labour movement. Scotland's revolution had been derailed. The Labour Party, fast becoming part of the parliamentary establishment, was the only alternative for the militant Red Clydesiders. They faced an uncomfortable welcome in Westminster.
Their view was you go to Parliament not to appease the middle classes, not to put forward a gradual reform programme, but to actually put a very confrontational socialist programme before the electorate and make the issue one of capitalism versus socialism.
James Maxton was the newly elected MP for the acutely impoverished Glasgow Bridgeton constituency. In these Glasgow slums, 14 of every 100 children died at birth. Adult life expectancy was 55. Work was scarce.
I lived in Meadow Road in Partick, and looking back one day, I counted it would be about 70 houses in that street. And at one time, there was only 3 men in the street working.
Maxton's own wife, Sissy, had died just months before after a year-long illness brought on by the birth of their child. The honourable member for Glasgow Bridgeton was deeply affected by his loss. The august conventions of his new workplace mattered little. Government Circular 51 denied free milk and hospital care to many impoverished children across the UK. Maxton was scathing.
I call it murder. I call the men who have walked into the lobby in support of that policy murderers.
The shock tactics of the Red Clydesiders were at odds with the placatory approach of the party leader. Ramsay MacDonald, the self-educated and illegitimate son of a Lossiemouth maidservant, thought socialism could succeed by stealth.
He described his philosophy as gradualism, that you gradually change society through reform. And then, as Keir Hardie put it, one day socialism will have come like a thief in the night.
MacDonald spent Christmas of 1923 in Lossiemouth at the Hillocks, the home he had bought for his late mother. The election of December that year had produced a hung parliament, with Labour holding the balance of power. His colonial-styled Moray home was where Britain's first Labour government was planned, where its first cabinet was selected. 50 years before, walking in the fields around Lossiemouth, his mother had pointed at a solitary ploughman in a distant field, saying, "Ramsay, thon's your father." By the January of 1924, the man who would never meet his father was kissing the hand of George V as Labour's first Prime Minister.
There was a tremendous feeling of optimism. This was going to change the world. Jimmy Maxson and Wheatley and these people.
With no clear majority, MacDonald's government promised little and delivered less. No nationalisation, no grand plan. The Housing Act introduced by Shettleston MP John Wheatley did create hundreds of thousands of new worker homes, but it was the only positive for a doomed administration.
There was a wee bit disappointment that the leaders, MacDonald and his friends, seemed to settle into the establishment too readily.
A Conservative vote of no confidence forced MacDonald out of Downing Street after only 259 days.
I believe we shall have it.
The subsequent Conservative administration, led by Stanley Baldwin, inherited an economy spiralling out of control. His Chancellor, Winston Churchill, reluctantly fixed the value of the pound to the value of gold. This was the gold standard. It set the value of goods at an artificially high price. Foreign customers found themselves having to pay more for Scottish products. Many took their orders elsewhere. To mitigate falling profits, British companies cut worker pay. In response, the mining unions called a general strike. Churchill predicted the overthrow of parliamentary democracy if the action succeeded. For 9 days, the state battled its striking workers. The military protected strike breakers and delivered essential supplies. The Trades Union Council withdrew support and ordered its men back to work, a call ignored only by the miners, who stayed out till starvation forced them back underground. The general strike had been a spectacular failure, to the delight of the Labour Party leader.
MacDonald was never in favour of the general strike. He said that the method of changing society through the general strike was never any good at any time, and even less good now.
The exertions of a speaking tour in support of the strike left Maxton hospitalised, but the condition of the defeated workers was critical. The last years of the 1920s saw the onset of the Depression, a worldwide slump reinforced by the effects of Churchill's gold standard plunged working men into unemployment and desperate poverty.
My father worked in the gasworks in Maryhill, and suddenly he got his books. And we used to stand at the window, the front room window, and he would say, "Do you see that new building down there? Well, that's what lost me my job. A new plant was built, and lots of people lost their job, including my father, and he was unemployed for many years after that."
MacDonald, now the MP for Seaham in County Durham, led his Labour Party back to minority government in 1929.
Mr. Webb?
Unable to recall the name of his health minister, MacDonald seemed ill-suited to tackling the vast challenges ahead.
Behind him... Behind him was Mr. Arthur Greenwood, who is going to the Ministry of Health.
Maxton was by now the chairman of the Independent Labour Party, a separate organisation within the Labour movement. With no chance of promotion to power, the situation offered him rhetoric without responsibility.
The man who suffers most in our midst today is one of the 2 million unemployed men. The government are proposing some changes in the way he is to be treated. Let us hope that it will be found possible to raise this man to a higher level than the 15 and threepence per week standard which is now proposed. There are no economic, financial or industrial reasons to prevent poverty being abolished.
By the winter of 1931, 2.75 million people were out of work. Maxton's plan was to improve state aid, to increase spending, and with luck, kick-start the economy. The Depression was worldwide. In the United States, huge infrastructure projects like the Hoover Dam were conceived to put more people into work. But in the UK, MacDonald's Labour government dumped the unemployed in a fruitless effort to balance the books.
Other radical voices like Keynes and the Liberal Party and so on were talking about spending your way out of recession. Well, that was unthinkable to politicians in that particular period.
As MacDonald vacillates, the crisis deepens. Gold rushes from the Treasury as foreign investors lose confidence in Britain.
The Bank of England is picturesquely referred to as the old lady of Threadneedle Street, but events of the past weeks must have given her many more white hairs.
By the 21st of August 1931, MacDonald's government holds only 4 days' worth of reserves in the Bank of England. A plan to cut unemployment pay yet further fatally splits the Labour cabinet. MacDonald's confidence had rarely looked so unconvincing.
The nation is in trouble. The nation is in difficulties. Not permanent trouble and not permanent difficulties. Temporary, purely temporary.
Mr. MacDonald's cabinet meets at noon today, probably for the last time. The whole country and the rest of the world is watching to see how Great Britain is going to put its financial affairs in order. The Prime Minister leaves for an audience with His Majesty the King, who has hurriedly returned from Balmoral.
I was on holiday at the time in Lossiemouth. I was a member of Parliament, but Parliament was in recess, and he telephoned to me twice every day to tell me what was happening. And he told me that day that he would be going to the King with his and the government's resignation, and he said that he expected to be in Lossiemouth, joining the rest of the family on holiday 24 hours or 36 hours later. That was his intention.
His intentions were overturned. The King and other party leaders convinced MacDonald to remain at the head of a national coalition government.
They tried to persuade him to become the Prime Minister of a national government. They said that a coalition of Conservatives and Liberals with Labour in opposition would not be strong enough to put through with sufficient popular support the economic measures which were necessary. Well, he resisted this until the King himself joined in and said that it was his duty as Prime Minister of the outgoing government to be Prime Minister of the incoming government to see the nation through this crisis.
MacDonald was applauded for putting country before party. But for Labour supporters, this was treachery on a grand scale.
That was the last straw. These people were traitors. They were traitors.
In September 1931, the leader of Britain's new national government returned home to Lossiemouth. Despite his painful